below. If you're wondering where you are, you're following Grandma. It's a bright sunny day and I'm in my cottage in Scotland, looking out through my study window onto Old Shorehead Green. It's common ground that belongs to the community, and it's where we have the right to hang our washing. In Scotland, and particularly along this east coast, this is an old tradition, drying your clothes on washing lines in wide open spaces close to the sea. The lines are tied onto upright metal posts that are cemented firmly into the green itself. There's a fresh water brook running alongside. It looks deceptively gentle as it burbles from the glens to meet the sea at danger point. Here, where sea and fresh water meet, the wind can be fierce, and today is one of those days. I can see the water is agitated and my neighbour's pillowcases are blowing madly on the washing line. As a resident of Old Shorehead, I have the right to hang my washing on the communal green, and I don't take this privilege lightly. It can be a challenge and a real joy. Visitors love to see sheets, duvet covers and rows of socks moving rhythmically or flapping gently. On days when there's a high wind, my washing provides real entertainment. As I fight to secure the sheet on the line or chase an escaping tea towel before it lands in the brook, passers-by simply stop to watch. It's amazing how a line of washing provides an opportunity for people's moods to change and conversation to begin. Who knew that the serenity and timeless quality of white sheets blowing in the wind might be an antidote to stress? Reminds me of that phrase, a breath of fresh air. Often that's a way of describing someone who's come into a discussion or a difficult situation with new thoughts and fresh ideas. Suddenly we're able to look at things in a different way. Conflict melts, and there's a chance of working constructively together. Now, that's a philosophical thought for my washing line. On a calm day when I'm simply pegging out laundry, I notice how people smile and slow down. Dog walkers pause, groups of tourists stop to take photos, and even those in a hurry can't resist taking a breath and making a quick comment. It's usually about the weather, the freshness of the clothes that have absorbed the sea air, or the time it will take things to dry. At other times it's about the customs and stories surrounding this area of Arbroath, known as the Fit of the Toon, the foot of the town. One day I was surrounded by an inquisitive group of international travel agents. They were charmed by the washing line tradition. They took photographs, chatted, and asked if I knew anything about this historic conservation area. As it happened, I did have one or two interesting stories, because since coming to live in Arbroath, I've spent time researching and looking at old books and maps. Initially, I was trying to find out how old my cottage is and who were the families who lived in it. In the process, I discovered the story of change in the town and the county of Angus. The travel agents were intrigued to hear how this part of the town, which is now a conservation area, has developed over the centuries. Originally, there was no organised port or landing place, and ships worked off an open beach, Old Shorehead, which is where my cottage was built. Then, in the 14th century, the Abbot of Arbroath Abbey, John Geddy, who sounds like a real breath of fresh air, as you'll hear later, he agreed with a local townsman that the abbey would fund a safe port where ships could find a quiet mooring, irrespective of the movements of the tide. The burghers of the town, for their part, agreed to help by removing stones, sand and other impediments until completion of the project. One report uses really intriguing vocabulary. They should also fill, set in place and weight with stones at all the arcas, ordered for the port at the discretion of the magistrates. It details tools and instruments I've never heard of, vangers, tribulos and gavilox ferio, which all seemed to mean they built a solid breakwater pier with timber cages which were reinforced with piled up stones and boulders. It was probably a very modest affair, but it would have provided a safe harbour for fishing, smuggling, and was welcome dry land for the hundreds of pilgrims who sailed miles to visit Arbroath Abbey. This abbey is world famous because it's where the original Declaration of Scottish Independence was signed 700 years ago. The travel agents were hanging on my every word as I described how pilgrims came by boat across the North Sea from Europe, whilst others sailed up from Northumbria in the south of England. Wherever they came from, they would all have landed on Old Shore Head, and then walked up the dusty high street which leads to the abbey. What a busy little spot it must have been. With the harbour safely built, life continued more easily. Smugglers went on smuggling, fishermen went on fishing, and pilgrims arrived regularly until a few centuries later, and there were huge storms, and the Abbot's harbour was badly damaged. In fact, it was described as ruinous, and the town was in a crisis. Without the regular travellers, the economy was in a mess and a new harbour was needed, but it wasn't until 1725 that it was agreed to dig out and build a new one a short distance along the coast. This one was to be made of stone, with an entrance that could be closed using a crane and booms. This was a big change because Arbroath could now accommodate large schooners carrying exotic cargoes from around the world. And by now 30 ships were owned by local businessmen. Sailing around this part of the Scottish coast has always been dangerous. 11 miles south of Arbroath and 27 miles from Dundee, ships face the terrifying Bell Rock, a sharp sandstone reef extending over 1,400 feet. It's shaped roughly like a slice of cheese turned onto its side, and for much of the time the reef is invisible underwater. In the 14th century, the abbot at the abbey managed to place a huge bell on it as a warning to sailors, hence its name, the Bell Rock. However, a Dutch pirate who enjoyed the spoils of shipwrecks thought it was too effective, and he removed it. The shipwrecks started again, and by the 19th century up to 6 ships sank every winter, and skippers began to avoid the area. With maritime trade under threat, big money was being lost. This was an economic disaster that couldn't be allowed to continue. Robert Stevenson, the grandfather of the author Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote Kidnapped, was an engineer who'd been involved in the building of many other lighthouses, and he came up with the novel idea of putting a light on the rock. This was visionary, controversial, and provided another real breath of fresh air. A lighthouse 11 miles out, built on a rock in the raging North Sea weather. Finally, in 1807, the authorities agreed it was possible, and Stevenson was commissioned to build the world-famous Bell Rock Lighthouse. It was quite satisfying the way the travel agents were hanging on my every word. I stopped. I took a breath of pure fresh sea air, turned and pointed out to sea to where the lighthouse was just visible on the horizon. I then continued with the remarkable story, describing how Stevenson had designed it in precise detail as a huge, intricate puzzle made up of separate stone pieces which were designed to be assembled not on dry land but in the North Sea. A sort of mega 19th century IKEA project. Stonemasons in prestigious quarries were commissioned to meticulously chisel each individual block so that it fitted precisely into the overall design. The individual stones were then transported overland to Arbroath, loaded onto small boats in the harbour, and depending on the tides, towed 11 miles out to sea in all kinds of weather conditions. Then came the tricky job of assembling the lighthouse. At low tide, the labourers worked on rocky outcrops that were dangerous and slippy. There was limited time to position the individual stone on the rock, cement it in, and hope the cement dried before the rising tide reached it and covered the rock itself. It was incredibly dangerous work, overseen by Stevenson himself, and it took 3 years for the lighthouse to successfully reach its full height of 115 feet. Since then, for 200 years, and despite the onslaught of huge waves, ferocious winds and storms, the Bell Rock Lighthouse has stood proud, and it continues to warn shipping of the danger of these rocks. At night, before I go to bed, I look through my bedroom window and I see the reassuring pattern of the lights flashing on the horizon. And when there's mist and visibility is down to 0, the morose sound of the Bell Rock foghorn can be heard booming ominously through the town. It's incredible to think only 20 years ago the lighthouse keepers lived there for 6-week shifts. Modernisation meant that around the turn of the century it became an automatic lighthouse. That must have been a huge change for the keepers and their families. A real coming down to earth after being isolated and exposed to the wild North Sea. I've come to realise that change has always been something this town has lived with and come to accept for centuries. Change came again when a second harbour was added, and one of the more successful ideas was to use the earth they dug out to reclaim land from the sea. They built a working boatyard on it, which is now Mackay's, one of only 2 boatyards on the east coast of Scotland. And every morning as I draw my curtains, I have a spectacular view. The sun rising over the horizon, Old Shore Head Green outside, and the boat of the week suspended and being repaired on blocks 15 feet up in the air. I never know what kind of craft has been craned out of the water or hauled up the slipway. It could be a puffin adventure boat from the Isle of May, an inshore fishing trawler, a lifeboat, a yacht, or even a full-masted schooner. The changing vessels are a surprise and a delight. Another breath of fresh air. Eventually, Arbroath became a major and very successful fishing port. And then, sadly, the fishing industry died. The main fish market moved to Peterhead, north of Aberdeen, and the last big boat, the Crystal Tide, sailed for the last time from the port in 2013. Once again, the town experienced more unemployment and change. But there's still a lot of local marine activity. There are small inshore boats catching crabs and lobsters, and sailing trips for holidaymakers who want to fish for mackerel or go out to see the Bell Rock Lighthouse. And in the inner harbour, there's a modern marina that welcomes 20th century yachtsmen. I wandered with the travel agents towards the far end of the green. Here the sea wall protects the area from the onslaught of the seas. It isn't called Danger Point for nothing. I encouraged them to look over the weather-beaten brick wall and see where precarious broken steps still go down one side of a small bridge onto the rocky inlet. Centuries ago, this is where the burn brought fresh hot water gushing from factories in the town. And as it flowed into the sea, the women would take risks and rinse their washing in the hot water. Hence the name, Danger Point. We imagined the women chatting and gossiping as they worked. It was a tough life, and washing clothes together would give them an opportunity to share problems and seek advice from their neighbours and friends. Danger Point will have heard many secrets and confidences exchanged over the years. Sometimes when I'm alone and listening to the small burn burbling its way into the sea, I imagine I can hear echoes of laughter and voices. I think that meeting up with the travel agents on our common ground brought them an insight and a fresh perspective about our town. A town that has had to learn to accept change and hardship and reinvent itself. For many people, this struggle continues, and reflecting on the past sometimes puts life into perspective. I imagine the support that people must have given each other in the past, and the encouragement to simply carry on. It's one of the things that I have come to recognise about Arbroath. It has a real sense of community, and future Following Grandma podcasts will reveal more. It's good to be living in a town where I can breathe easily, and I know I have neighbours and friends with values. Looking out, I see my neighbour's already taking in her washing, and my machine is beeping downstairs to remind me that my lovely white duvet cover and pillowcases are ready for their weekly outing. It's time for me to hang up my washing, but more importantly, to remember to take time to breathe in that refreshing local sea air. Keep following Grandma.